Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another book review on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and today we are taking a look at a brand new book that has just come on the market, Serbian Weapons of Victory, or Serbian Army Weapons of Victory, 1914 to 1918. This is co-authored by Branislav Stankovic and John P. Sheehan. Branislav is a Serbian historian and photographer. John Sheehan is an American-based World War I arms collector, and between them, they have put out the first of what they intend to be 3 volumes on Serbian arms of the First World War. So, in Volume 1 here, they are taking a look at small arms. Basically, we're talking rifles, bayonets, and ammunition. They don't touch on handguns. And Serbia was, of course, one of the very small powers involved in the First World War. It's generally overlooked. However, Serbia had a number of unique firearms that it had purchased for its military from the 1880s up until World War I, and today they are some of the rarest World War I firearms to find because, well, if I were to condense the Serbian army's performance in World War I into just a very few short sentences, basically, in 1914, they held their own remarkably well, and they were able to fend off all attackers, I think much to many people's surprise. However, by late 1915, they were low on supply, they were attacked from 2 fronts simultaneously, and the Serbian army pretty much crumbled. They were forced to retreat back over the mountains into Albania, where they were evacuated off the Albanian coast by the Allied navies, off to the Greek island of Corfu. And in that process, first of all, it was an absolutely horrendous retreat march by the remnants of the Serbian army, and the number of people who starved and froze to death on that march is tragic. And in the process, they lost virtually all of their small arms. And between the battles in 1914 and 1915 and that retreat to the Albanian coast, there weren't a whole lot of Serbian military small arms left. And if you now add 100 years to that, plus the various wars in the Balkans that have followed, World War II, you can imagine the number of surviving examples today is really, really tiny. So it's actually really cool to get to take a look at a book that goes through the history of all these guns that are so unusual to find today, and guns that are really not documented anywhere else, certainly not in English. I don't know how well these are documented in Serbia, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's really not much written there either, because it is such a specialized topic. At any rate, this book starts with the basically an 1878 pattern of single-shot Mauser rifle that the Serbian government, Serbian military purchased. They had to be a little bit different, and they came up with, instead of using the German, basically 11mm cartridge, they came up with their own slightly longer 10.15 by 63mm cartridge. Had a lighter bullet, smaller diameter bullet than the German round, and a higher velocity. And it was arguably kind of better in all ways. But of course, it was a single-shot black powder rifle, and in 1878, 1880, that kind of rifle's days were certainly numbered. That would be replaced, well, they would add on to that with a carbine of basically the Mauser 1884 pattern with a tubular magazine. Interesting that they did not have single-shot carbines. Right about the time that they were ready to make an order for carbines to supplement the rifles, Mauser was ready with this tube magazine system and sold them that for carbines instead. They then would go on to use, they're going to sidetrack a little bit, and there was substantial Serbian use of Berdan Rifles, 1870 Berdan Rifles, as well as Mosin Nagant rifles, which we'll touch on in a moment. After the single-shot weapons, Serbia went back to Mauser and ended up with a series of bolt-action, magazine-fed, smokeless powder Mauser repeating rifles in 7x57mm, 7mm Mauser, one of the best cartridges that Mauser ever came up with. And that's what they took into World War I, which is kind of cool. Not a whole lot of countries were actually using, well, not a lot of countries outside of South America were actually using the 7mm Mauser cartridge. Now, where this takes a couple of turns, and it would be very easy for the book, for the authors, to have simply focused on the Serbian contract guns and left it at that. However, they didn't, and about half of this book covers rifles of foreign production that were used by Serbia. And these fall really into 2 camps. They are Russian, which are largely rifles that were provided as military aid, 1870 Berdans and 1891 Mosin Nagants, which were used in very large numbers. The Serbian government didn't have a lot of money to put into its military, and every time they got into, well, certainly with World War I, when they got into a major war, they pretty much always quickly found that the weapons that they had allocated to the military were almost immediately in need of replacement. They were losing arms in combat, and they didn't have a big reserve stockpile of weapons. So they were often very grateful to get things like large stockpiles of Mosin Nagants from the Russians as military aid. Now, the other major sort of foreign weapons that would be used by the Serbians were French weapons, actually. After the Serbian army was evacuated off to Corfu, they were given time to basically rest, heal up as best they could, and refit. And Serbia was completely occupied at that point. There was no way that Serbia was going to be able to produce anything. And so the French government actually took on the responsibility of arming and equipping the Serbian military. So after, when you look at 1916 and later in World War I, Serbia was pretty much armed with French rifles and machine guns and ammunition, all of the frontline Serbian infantry divisions. So they had Lebels and they had Berthiers and they had Hotchkiss machine guns. And so those are covered in some surprising detail here in the book, along with the Russian guns. So that's really cool because, let's be honest, the French and even the Russian guns are things that aren't all that well covered in much English language literature. So this is not only the uniquely Serbian firearms, it's also covering the guns that they used from other people. So that's really pretty cool. There's not a lot of tabulated data, but this is pretty well organized. It's easy to track down. It begins with an abbreviated version of the Serbian experience of World War I, which I think is very important. It's wise of the authors to include that because most people reading this book aren't going to know anything about what Serbia did in the First World War. And so it's important to preface this study of their firearms with a story of what these guns actually went through and how they were used. And that's not just World War I. They also cover the First and Second Balkan Wars and some other smaller conflicts in there. After that, they're going to get into each of the firearms in chronological order, the rifles, the carbine versions, and other specialty versions that were also made, as well as having sections on each of the cartridges that was used. So it's a well-organized book. It's a well-put-together book. It's a quite readable book. The photography is good. One of my quibbles is that I'm assuming for reasons of layout, because this is definitely a small-scale, sort of not a mass production book. For reasons of layout, they have generally the picture captions are at the beginning of a series of pages with pictures. So if you're looking at a picture of half a dozen rifles, you'll probably have to flip back a couple pages to find the caption for that picture to see what each item in the picture is. It would have been nice to have the captions right in there alongside each individual picture, but I suspect there was a fairly good reason that was not done. This is my other quibble, unfortunately, is going to limit distribution of this book. Now, it's a niche subject to begin with, but it is obvious. I mean, by far, it is the greatest source of information on something as specific as Serbian firearms. So if you're interested in it, I would absolutely recommend getting a copy. It's well worth the money, which is, by the way, $110. So it's not a cheap book. That's something that we just have to deal with small production. It's very niche subject books. But the only way to get it is to basically send a check to the author's P.O. box, and he will mail you a copy of the book. The author in this case specifically is John Sheehan. It's easier for us in the U.S. to mail a check to him in Nevada than to send a check to Serbia. So there is no Amazon link. There is no publisher's website that I can send you to. It is all direct communication with the author, which is, I think, unfortunate. I think that's going to limit distribution of the book in an unfortunate way. But if you're interested, don't let that dissuade you. Send him a check, you'll get a book, and you'll be very happy to have that book, I suspect. So if you're interested in World War I, if you're interested in the Balkans in particular, definitely worth getting. There are plans apparently for volumes 2 and 3. Volume 2 is going to be machine guns and artillery. Volume 3 apparently is going to be basically uniforms and equipment. So keep an eye out for those if you're also interested in them. Check out the book, and thanks for watching.